Okay, well, good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock on Wednesday, June 30th. This is a workshop meeting of the Aberdeen City Council. My name is Deanne Shaw, and I am the council president, and I will be trying to help host a little bit tonight. The published purpose of our meeting is to discuss legislative changes that will impact the Aberdeen Police Department operations. With that, I would ask our clerk to take the roll.
Okay. Councilmember Andrews.
Here.
Councilmember, I'm going to go non-alphabetical, sorry. Councilmember Short.
Here.
Councilmember Richrod.
Here.
Councilmember Ross.
Here.
Councilmember Ellis.
Here.
Councilmember Kennedy.
Present.
Councilmember Mackey.
Here.
Councilmember Shaw.
Here.
Councilmember Koshman.
Here.
Councilmember Taylor.
Here.
Let me see, 1, 2, 3. And we're missing 2. What 2 are we missing?
Councilmember Francie's signing on right now.
Okay, there we go. Councilmember Francie.
Here.
Okay.
Gordon's missing.
Oh, Councilmember Gordon's missing.
And for a workshop, the primary purpose is just to make sure we have a quorum. It looks like we have a quorum, so thank you. So with all that said, our purpose again here tonight is to hear from our police chief. So without a whole lot more to say, I'm going to turn it over to you, Chief Shoemate.
Thank you, Council President Sean. If I look like I'm going back, if I have a couple different screens and my camera's right in the middle, so I apologize if it doesn't look like I'm speaking directly to you, but I certainly do appreciate the council taking the time, particularly if ultimately the desire was to have tonight off. I do thank you all for having this workshop because I do think it's very important with the number of changes that are coming about. I do want to thank the members of the council, Mayor Shea, as well as I see a number of my fellow department heads on board here as well. I've had some communication with the media, and so I appreciate their presence. And of course, the reason we do what we do to our citizens in attendance as well. And it looks like we're already up to 18 participants, so that's awesome. But before we get started, Council President Shaw, with the PowerPoint, I did want to share some thoughts regarding this past legislative session, if I may. So it would be accurate to say that law enforcement leaders, among other groups throughout the state of Washington, we spent a tremendous amount of time communicating with our state legislature throughout the legislative session. I got to give a shout out to Chief Myers. He spent a tremendous amount of time, not only specifically with a number of our legislatures, but he worked also with AWC, among other groups. Since the end of the legislation, law enforcement leaders, we've been evaluating, to be frank, best way to describe it, it would be unprecedented amount of change that occurred as it relates to public safety. I've been involved with several meetings associated with the various changes over the past several months. Those meetings included the association that most sheriffs and police chiefs are associated with, which is our Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, as well as our insurance carrier, Washington City's Insurance Authority. There has been a great deal of legal input from attorneys associated with these various groups as it relates to the changes. Unfortunately, there is still a fair amount of uncertainty with a lot of the laws, which is what you'll see once we go through the PowerPoint. I can tell you in my 32 years of serving as a police officer in Grace Harbor County, I cannot remember a time when there were more change placed upon public safety in a single year. And it's because of that I felt it was important to conduct this workshop so our citizens and of course our elected city leaders can be provided the information on what those changes are looking like. While those in the profession don't always like change, I know for myself, I like to be set in my ways. We're used to change. It happens almost on a yearly basis. I will tell you though, from the way law enforcement functioned back in the late 80s when I started to where we are at today, the profession has made substantial improvements during the time, particularly in Washington State. And if I may share, I had the experience of attending the FBI National Academy back in 2011 and got a sense of how other law enforcement entities throughout the state of Washington, actually throughout the world, operated. And I really think the Pacific Northwest, as it relates to the United States, really leads the way in professional policing. With that said, the profession has certainly had its challenges and shortcomings over the years, not only in our state, but obviously throughout our region and nation. During the last 16 months, our society dealt with the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, followed by civil unrest. All of this fueled the call for police reform, and Washington State has certainly taken the lead on that change. The 2021 legislative changes that we will discuss here tonight were significant. I have read many articles concerning the changes, and many were titled Police Accountability, Police Reform, Overhauling Policing. One term that I think more closely illustrates what the majority of the legislature was telling public safety was to reimagine policing. But what exactly does that look like? In addition to police accountability, the legislature really focused on limiting police involvement with non-criminal matters. It is this area that is significant for the profession because we have always been the catch-all for laws passed not only by our state legislatures, but of course by you all, our duly elected city council members. Our citizens have been used to calling the police on a variety of issues that were not always criminal in nature. Individuals in crisis with mental health challenges is probably one of the greatest ones. Our state legislature wants these individuals handled by mental health professionals, and to be frank, law enforcement would prefer that. Unfortunately, and especially here in Grays Harbor County, we do not have a system in place to immediately and properly address our citizens in crisis. And so, up to this point, it has fallen on law enforcement. While the changes that we will be discussing here shortly are significant, we will respond and be responsive to the needs of our community as we have an intrinsic role to promote public safety. However, as a law enforcement leader, I want to make sure the public we serve is aware of the changes and how it will impact the way our officers do their jobs. We understand that not all of our citizens will agree with the changes come about, but we all need to be informed. There have already been several issues raised with the state legislatures regarding some of the unintended consequences, but it is not clear what the true impact will be to our citizens and when or if the legislator will take any corrective action. The earliest we could see follow-ups would be the next legislative session, which starts in January. There is much work to do to implement these changes, but we are committed to working cooperatively to get it done. I will say, as law enforcement officers, we support the rule of law, and our state legislatures have set the law. So we must now meet the challenge and provide the best service possible to our citizens. So with that said, are there any questions before I get started with the PowerPoint? All right, then if hopefully I can share my screen here. And we will get going to and does that come up for everybody? Awesome. Okay, so as Council President Shaw made mention, this is covering the 2021 legislative session. It is a summary of the police-related laws passed by the Washington State Legislature. I will tell you, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of laws for which I've tried to condense down into a couple dozen, for the most part, PowerPoint presentation that has some of the specifics of those laws. Yeah, not including the cover sheet and the last page, 27 slides altogether. So just a bit of an overview of the legislative session. The 2021 legislative session brought a renewed focus on policing and public safety. As a member of the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, which we commonly refer to as WASPC, our organization worked with many legislatures during the session. We support measures that we believe brought our communities together and led to constructive improvement of public service of law enforcement in our state. I will be frank, there was some very frank conversations with law enforcement leaders in our state legislatures, oftentimes to the point where they said they heard us, but they either didn't agree with us or they wanted to go a different direction. And you know, I appreciate that. And I certainly appreciate our local legislatures taking time to listen to us. As you can see there on the third bullet, a total of 335 bills were passed, many of them focused on policing. Several bills involve mandated changes that will have a financial impact to the city, and we will be working on tracking those expenses. Overall, a lot of positive changes came out from the various bills. I will tell you, throughout my entire career, I always was driven of wanting to know what I can do better. And I would submit that as an entity, as a profession, that is what we've always wanted. If there's something that we can do to do better, to serve our community, we want to do that. But there is also a number of changes that will have some unintended consequences, and we will get into the specifics of that. Questions before we move on. And I will, at the end of each bill that we cover, I'll make sure I stop and ask if there's questions. And if Council President Shaw, I only have about 6 people, so if there's others that are raising your hand, if you can help me with that, that'd be awesome. So just a few slides on kind of an overview of, if you will.
Chief Schumate?
Yes.
Chief Schumate, I only get to see about 6 as well, so I will take the hint that we should save our questions till the end of each bill's presentation, but council members should speak up if they have questions because we don't have the whole grid view.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. So first I want to cover what current duty of use due care for law enforcement. As you see, I have underlined, this is currently what it is, pre-existing duty to use due care. Law enforcement, we are mandated that the force that we do use must be reasonable and necessary. We are mandated to drive with due care and caution. We are mandated to respond to domestic violence situations, and also part of that, there's a mandate to make a custodial arrest within 4 hours if we have probable cause to believe that an assault has occurred and we can identify a primary aggressor. And then, of course, we are mandated to reasonably investigate child abuse claims, which, of course, we certainly support all of that. What has changed? There now is more specific, excuse me, requirements that are placed on law enforcement. There is a legal requirement to de-escalate and exhaust all lesser means of force. Generally speaking, I support that. Use of force is more limited, and we'll certainly get into specifics of what that is. Can only use force to overcome actual resistance. Police tactics are more limited, and tools and equipment are more limited. And again, I'll get into the specifics of that shortly. So what needs to change? Policies must be reviewed and updated to be consistent with law. I will tell you, I'm blessed that the city of Aberdeen has utilized Lexipol for many years, well before I even came on board. It is a service that is well worth the money that we spend, because it is basically a group of attorneys that anytime there is a change in law, anytime that there is a best practice, anytime there is case law, then they evaluate that and they submit to us what those policies are. But I will tell you, here we are at the last day of the month of June. Obviously, tomorrow's July 1st. We have yet to get those policies because they are enormous. There's a lot of change coming about. And of course, you know, we want to make sure that our officers are prepared on knowing what they need to do for the most part come July 25th. And one of the ways you do that is through policy. So we are hopeful that we're going to start getting those hopefully after the 4th of July weekend, so we can start getting our folks educated. As you see, second bullet, agency practices and procedures must be reviewed and updated to minimize risk of officer injury and civil liability. Officers must be trained on the new laws, new policies, and new procedures. And in some cases, that's easier said than done, if you will. Especially tenured officers who have been doing certain things a certain way for, in some cases, decades, and now we are going to be changing how we want them to do it. And by the way, you're going to be required to do that July 25th. So it's a huge undertaking. And then the last one, personnel practices must be updated to be consistent with law. I will tell you, we don't have all the answers yet, but we do have staff scheduled for really kind of the first main push of all these laws. We've been doing some in-service training with our sergeants, who in turn will provide in the information to our line staff. But on July 13th and 14th, we will be having each team coming in on their days off to provide the information that we have thus far. So the overview of the bills, there are 14 bills altogether that I want to touch on tonight, generally referred to as they're police-related bills, if you will. For those who are interested, you can certainly, if you Google the Washington State Legislature bill information, it'll pull up that website. And on that website, it automatically defaults to the 2020-2021 legislative session. And it's just a matter of putting in the number. You don't put in the letters. You just, like for police tactics, if you put in 1054, that's going to pull up the history of that bill. And then if you go to the very bottom of that, under its session law, and you click on that, it will give you the entire bill as it was passed. Anyway, just information in case some want to do a little bit more of their own research. But so with respect to the House, these are all the House bills that we'll be covering. The police tactics is a big one. The potential impeachment disclosure is one I generally support. Audits of independent investigation really deals with the process. Juvenile access to attorneys is a pretty significant one. Electronic recordation of custodial interrogations is one that I think the state definitely is pushing for agencies to want to have body cameras. That certainly would make that requirement easier for us. 1267 Office of Independent Investigations, that particular law deals with the state forming an investigative unit to handle or investigate officer-involved critical incidents. The use of force, 1310, that's a big one that we will spend a little bit of time on. And then 1320 protection orders, just to give you an idea of some of these bills, 1320 is 320 pages long. So some of these bills are pretty enormous. And then for the Senate side, the Senate bills that we'll be covering, Senate Bill 5038, that's the open carry of weapons at demonstrations. That could have come into play with some of the protest demonstrations that we had just over a year ago here in Aberdeen. 5051 deals with the decertification of corrections and peace officers. 5055 is the grievance arbitration panels throughout the state of Washington. The 5066 is the duty to intervene. And 5259, that's a law enforcement data collection, which really is an analysis component that the state instituted. And then the last one is the State versus Blake. That's the one was the legislature's fix for the when the state Supreme Court deemed unconstitutional our violation of the Uniform Controlled Substance Act, or the simple possession of what was illegal drugs. And as I shared, as we move through each bill, I have a point here to make sure I ask questions. So House Bill 1054, and this is the one that deals with, we refer to it often as police tactics. And as you can see, and I will put the effective dates of all these bills, this one will be effective just over 3 weeks on July 25th. And so this one starts off with prohibits the use of chokehold or neck restraints in any circumstance. Now, I will tell you that, chokeholds and neck restraints was something that I was taught back when I went through the academy. But back then, the only tools that we had was a gun, a PR-24, and then restraints that you could use. Obviously, we have added over the years a tremendous amount of other tools for our officers. But as you see there, I underline circumstance, because it was brought to the attention of the legislature that it's like, okay, well, what about if the officer lost his firearm and he was in a deadly force encounter? And the legislature was sending a message, it would be our appearance, because they did not put in that they could use a chokehold or a neck restraint, even if you could use deadly force. I think it's somewhat telling on that. Next is the prohibits no-knock warrants. For those who may not be aware, no-knock warrants not used very often, but situations where police believe they would be harmed if notice was given of a warrant. Oftentimes locating violent suspects, at times illegal drug activity, you may use that to prevent individuals from flushing down the toilet, contraband. But I'm sure most people are familiar with the Breonna Taylor death, occurred back in March of 2020. That was a no-knock warrant that the law enforcement went to the wrong place, and unfortunately it resulted in her death. And that really was the driving point for the state deciding that they wanted to prohibit no-knock warrants. Third bullet there, CJTC, that's the Criminal Justice Training Center. When this bill was initially proposed, it pretty much banned apprehension canines. We were fortunate that there was definitely some pushback, not only from law enforcement, but from a number of community members. Whereas they removed that provision. However, they do have in there that CJTC will be working on developing a model policy for training as it relates to the use of canines. Fourth bullet there, prohibits the use of tear gas except in 3 circumstances: harm posed by a riot, barricaded subject, or a hostage situation. As you see there, prior to deploying tear gas, law enforcement officers must exhaust available and appropriate alternatives, obtain authorization from supervising officer, announce the intent to use tear gas, and allow sufficient time and space for the subject to comply. That's fairly straightforward. I thank goodness in our community within Grace Harbor County, that's not something we have to contend with like they do in Seattle. And that really is kind of focused on the activities that had gone in there and kind of went south in some aspects. Next bullet there, prior to deploying tear gas, except within if it's not within a correctional facility, that is, law enforcement agency also receives authorization from the highest elected official. Obviously for us, that would be the mayor. So in this case, if the mayor is going to be out of town on a plane, then we're certainly going to want to make sure we have the contact information for who is covering the mayor's responsibility in his absence. And then the jurisdiction in which the tear gas is to be used. And then next, prohibits the use and acquisition of military equipment, and agencies must return or destroy any military equipment by December 31st of 2022. So initially, our MRAP was on that chopping block, and thank goodness the legislature did ultimately allow that, providing that it wasn't armed, which ours is not. So that is exempt. However, this particular law did exempt 50 caliber or greater firearms. And unfortunately, our shotguns are greater than 50 caliber. And our shotguns that we use are less lethal, which we often refer to there, the bean bags. And so it's unknown if the department will have to remove this less lethal option by July 25th. There are legal opinions that are being sought. There's some indication that that was not the legislature's intent. There are some laws that indicate that they want law enforcement to utilize less lethal when at all possible. So it would not, you would not think that the legislature would want to remove a less lethal option. However, one single word and intent is very important for us, particularly when officers could be faced with decertification. So we're certainly hoping that we get some direction before July 25th on this. Questions on this part of House Bill 1054 before I move on?
I have a quick question.
Yes, Nick. Councilman Kennedy.
Thank you very much. So on the item that you brought up that would require authorization by the highest elected official. In most cases that I've been reading lately, in the absence of the mayor, that falls to the council president. Do you know if this would be a similar situation, or would this have to be like somebody in the actual executive branch of the city government?
So as with a lot of
May
these.
I? May
Yes.
I? So thank you. According to the charter, a combination of the charter and the city ordinances, our mayor pro tem is the council president. So if the mayor is not available, it would go to the council president. Ours is silent as to what happens if both of those two are absent.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mayor Schaaf here.
Yes,
Deanne,
Mayor.
aren't you excited now that if something like that comes up, one of us gets to authorize the use of tear gas? Well,
I think everybody's hoping that that never ever has to happen in our community. But
Well,
yeah.
I would just share that thankfully in our city's case, we aren't dealing with some of the issues some of other cities are, and I would be able to defer to the professional judgment of our police chief.
Absolutely. I just am being facetious here. I think it's interesting that they put that in there because are there any cities where the mayor is actually trained to make a decision such as that? I mean, you know, authorized to use tear gas, that's pretty big police stuff, if you ask me.
I think you just noted the next AWC training you're gonna have to go through, Mayor Shave.
All right. I'm just, thank you.
So
You bet.
actually, though, my question on that, as you were going through that, Chief, on the tear gas question was, is it possible, one thing to think about for the elected official or officials to have in place a written agreement or protocol that the chief relies on before making that call? So it's not some, last minute kind of phone call thing. That would be
Well,
one thing I would want to look at.
Right. Well, we have a pretty exhaustive list of policies, and we will obviously be getting more policies on board as it relates to this. And then we also have a separate set of policies as it relates to our crisis response unit. And it really would be our crisis response unit that would be the entity that's trained, but also has the policies in place as far as when we would utilize tear gas. And so that certainly would be something that, we'd be happy to educate either you or Mayor Shaver or anybody on our policies. They're pretty detailed, but I think we have our bases covered when it comes to when we would apply, especially with respect to the changes in the law. And then actually one more thing I did want to add as it relates to military equipment. So the Aberdeen Police Department, we have acquired, I think we have 18 rifles, and this was many, many years ago through military surplus that used to be the patrol rifles. And I think it was prior to me coming on, early 2018, when the city authorized the department to purchase new rifles. And part of that was also the rifle buyback program, which employees had the opportunity, if they wanted, to buy that back. I will tell you, even before this legislative session came up, the agency has been trying to figure out a way to send these firearms back to the federal government. But as you can imagine, the bureaucracy with that has been challenging. So we will continue to do that, especially in light of this. And then the other, as far as military equipment, we do have we have a robot, but that is not something we believe we'll be able to continue to utilize that. We will just have to report that to WASPIC. But the only thing that I think we're going to be mandated to return are those rifles that are no longer in use.
Chief Schumate,
Yes.
are you going to send us this PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, all right, because I was trying to take some notes and that's a lot of notes, so
Yes, my apologies. I thought it'd be better for me to go through it first, then I'll send it out to everybody. So.
Oh, certainly, sir. I just was gonna ask if you could send it out to us, so afterwards. Thank you.
Absolutely, $5 a piece. We got it. So.
All right,
No.
I'll send you.
So.
Do we have an idea on that next to the last point on the use of military weapons? Do we have an idea on a decision on that, or are we just still kind of in limbo?
Oh, we're in limbo. That's
okay.
So the one, and again, these entities, so like WASPIC and WCIA, they're quick to point out that, okay, we'll give you some legal thoughts, but you need to refer to your legal counsel. And so I have provided the Corporation Counsel with a number of inquiries. I'm sure she's still working on those, but technically what we're being told, if it says that it's, it would be a violation to have our less lethal shotguns, but that was not the legislature's intent, is what we're being told. Well, where does that leave us? We're not sure. So we are hoping to get further guidance. There is another meeting, I think it's next Tuesday or Wednesday I have several more meetings coming up. I think that's one is with WCIA as well. And it's another overview of 1310, which would cover part of this as well. So hopefully we're getting more answers here in the near future. So on to still House Bill 1054 on tactics continued. This bill also deals with vehicle pursuits. And so the way the law is read is unless an officer has probable cause, and I have that underlined because that is a very big deal for us right now. The current law is if we have reasonable suspicion, and reasonable suspicion is basically based on an officer's training and experience. There's a reason to believe that an individual is engaged in some type of criminal activity. And if somebody doesn't stop for us when we turn the lights on and they were to run, that's considered felony eluding if it gets past the fail to stop part of the law. And then we can pursue. That is no longer going to be the case come July 25th. And they added the additional level of probable cause. And probable cause is the level that we need to make an arrest. And if you're interested in exactly what that level is, it's an officer has knowledge of such facts who would lead a reasonable person to believe that a particular individual is committing or is about to commit a criminal act. So the officers and those who've been doing this for a period of time, we have a pretty good understanding of what reasonable suspicion is for us and what probable cause is for us. So as that first bullet says, that prohibits vehicle pursuits unless an officer has probable cause that a violent crime or a sex offense has or is committed, or the second prong of this, or reasonable suspicion of driving under the influence. And I will tell you that latter part got added much later in this whole process because the legislature really wanted I think some groups would have preferred that law enforcement have no pursuits whatsoever, and at least they recognize that the violent crimes, law enforcement should be pursuing those who are committing murders and rapes and robberies and things of that nature. The second bullet there, the officer is required to receive authorization to engage in a pursuit from a supervising officer, and so that's another point that is going to be somewhat challenging. Because engaging in the pursuit, the officer technically cannot engage in the pursuit until he provides the supervisor with information that will establish probable cause, and then the supervisor will say, "Okay, you are authorized to pursue." So, I just from my own experience, when you see a situation, and now they're going to have to make sure, okay, it meets the elements of what this is, I can pursue. But before I can even start the pursuit, I need to contact my supervisor and let them know these are all the details I have. Am I authorized to pursue? And obviously, during that time, if somebody's speeding away, that's that much more distance they're getting away from law enforcement. So, this is a pretty significant change from the way we've been doing it. The third prong there, officers will be prohibited from pursuing all other crimes where suspects flee. So some of the crimes that we will no longer pursue, all theft cases, including motor vehicles. So if you call up and somebody was in your vehicle and they took off on your vehicle and an officer found them and attempted to stop them and they fled, that officer would have to discontinue because that is exempt come July 25th. All possession, stolen property, malicious mischief complaints, all assault third complaints. And assault third pretty much is, as well as you can see on the PowerPoint, your police officers, firefighters, healthcare workers, school bus transit operators, judicial officers, employees. Assault third is also individuals who violate a court order and then assault that person for which the order was the petitioner. And if they fled the vehicle, we would not pursue. It also, or if you're injured as a result of a deadly weapon, but it doesn't rise to the level of a class or assault second or assault first. And then also misdemeanor offenses that include the domestic violence assault fourth. As I mentioned, that's a mandatory response from law enforcement. It's a mandatory arrest if we have PC within 4 hours and we can identify a primary aggressor. However, if they get in a vehicle and flee, we will not be able to pursue. And then any violation of court orders, hit and run with serious injury, we could not pursue unless it raises to the level of a vehicular homicide or vehicular assault, and then illegal drug activity. So, the list of when we can pursue is pretty, it truly is violent offenses. And that's your manslaughters, your kidnapping and arson, your assault second and first degree, extortion, robbery, drive-by shootings, and then your vehicular assaults and vehicular homicides. Pretty much all other types of crimes. If an individual flees, we will not be able to pursue. Questions on that before I move on to the next part of 1054?
This is Councilmember Ellis.
Yes.
Chief, how does this affect your ability to to follow up on motor vehicle running red lights, people speeding, things of that sort.
I think the next slide is going to cover that exactly, Councilwoman Ellis, if I could. No, let me back up. So what I will tell you is this, the individuals, if one of the biggest fears is that, so we have individuals that's all they do, they run. It doesn't matter. In some cases, it's only misdemeanor offenses for which they did. They are going to run from police. Our fear, of course, those who are willing to commit crimes, if they know that all they have to do is flee in a motor vehicle, that we will not pursue them. Law enforcement's fear is that this is something that's going to continue. Now, there's another part that I'll get into that will talk about what we refer to as Terry stops, which is where we had the reasonable suspicion piece, and we make contact with an individual. And if that individual decides to walk away, it's the whole use of force piece. Law enforcement is going to be somewhat limited to be able to physically detain that individual minus probable cause that a crime has been committed, or there's an imminent threat of danger to the person or someone else. And so there's kind of two bills that are coming in together. But I'll be frank, it's concerning that someone would decide, okay, well, I only committed an infraction, but if I run from the police, I know they're not going to chase me. I guess the stats will eventually tell. That is something that we do plan on trying to do, is document anytime that we attempted to stop someone and they fled from us. So at least there will be some statistics, at least from our agency, that we will be able to supply to WASP.
Chief Schumate, I have a
Okay.
quick question.
Yes, Councilman Kennedy.
Thank you very much. Will the police departments be able to develop policies and procedures that, if the situation warrants, that they can take certain actions to help prevent a suspect from fleeing in a motor vehicle, like using a patrol car to block them in to some extent, or identifying a vehicle and somehow disabling it if the situation warrants, so that the vehicle chase just isn't a factor at all?
Yeah, I think the challenge, and I know exactly what you're talking about, Nathan, there definitely are products out there that can be mounted to the front of the vehicles, and they can be shot out and underneath other vehicles and disable that vehicle. But I think so of course there's a cost to that. But number two, the way the law is written is officers cannot even engage until they've established probable cause, and then they get permission from the supervisor to pursue. So I'm just here to tell you from my own experience, just those few seconds, you're not going to be able to be in a position to do certain things. Now, we already have policies in place that will deal with other types of maneuvers, like when you're talking about boxing in, and there's another maneuver called the Pitton maneuver that we utilize, but those really are going to be but that's a use of force. And I think once we get to the use of force part, you'll see kind of where we're at as it relates to what officers can and cannot do. Okay, I'll move on then to 1054 continued. So this one here, the first bullet, very easy. We do that anyway, requires uniformed peace officers to be reasonably identifiable. Next one, prohibits law enforcement officer from firing a weapon at a moving vehicle with one exception. And so pretty much now, unless, and that officer is going to have to justify that vehicle, a motor vehicle itself is not considered a deadly weapon. But if somebody were to use that vehicle and then try to run you over, the officer will be justified to use deadly force, but there's going to have to be a situation where it was not reasonable for them to try to get out of the way. So the legislature was pretty evident that that is not something that they want police officers to do, is shooting at moving vehicles. So with respect to the House Bill 1054, key considerations, as I mentioned earlier, the chokeholds and the neck restraints are prohibited even when the use of deadly force would be justified. The term violent offense relating to vehicular pursuits may cause a misinterpretation of the requirements of the bill. So this really is where officers and supervisors are going to need to remember the specifics of the law. and which laws we can pursue for if we have probable cause, and of course, which ones we don't. My fear is you're going to see more and more agencies just go to a complete no pursuit policy, and I think that can be very challenging. Of course, if the entire state went to that, so we'll have to see how that plays out. That was considerations, key concerns, an increase by those committing crimes running from police. I think I shared that already with Councilwoman Ellis, and expect those individuals will continue to commit crimes unless arrested by other means, not in a vehicle. And I will tell you, there's been a number of crimes that have been committed within our jurisdiction from people who are not from our jurisdiction, and then they flee. And so, unfortunately, we may have situations where we're just not able to identify who committed that crime. The one that I can think of is it was a theft, shoplift at Safeway. Individual had fled. State Patrol ultimately got in pursuit with that individual. The individual did wreck. That individual, obviously from out of the area, but was wanted on various other crimes. Under, of course, these changes, State Patrol would not be able to pursue that vehicle. Questions before I move on to the next bill? Okay. Next is House Bill 1088. This one here I can go through relatively quickly. This is something that I do support is potential impeachment disclosures. We often refer to a Brady list or a Brady officer. Officers doing things that would place them on a Brady list affects the credibility of the profession, to be quite frank. And so the law will provide more guidance on this issue. As you can see there, it does require each county prosecutor to develop and adopt written protocol by 2022, July 1st. The types of conduct that must be disclosed, how Brady and PID disclose information should be shared and maintained, what circumstances an officer may be removed from the Brady list, requires local Brady protocols to be reviewed every 2 years, requires the Criminal Justice Training Center to provide online Brady disclosure training, and then requires law enforcement agencies to report Brady disclosures within 10 days. So that definitely will be on myself and HR. And then requires a law enforcement agency prior to hiring an officer with previous law enforcement experience to inquire and verify whether the officer has ever been subject to a Brady disclosure. And I certainly support that, because it's always, while laterals are awesome because they certainly save you a ton of money when it comes to training, it can be problematic if you have an individual leaving an agency that perhaps did something wrong and you're not made aware of it. So I support this provision as well. I am happy to report the Aberdeen Police Department has no officers that are Brady officers, so that's an awesome thing. But it does remain unclear what, if any, circumstances an officer may be removed from the Brady list. And for those who may be inquiring what can get you on a Brady list, that is some things that would definitely get you fired and charged if you committed a Class A or B felony, domestic violence assault, conviction of a domestic violence assault, sex offenses, things of that nature. And I know there are others as well. Questions on this bill? Okay, House Bill 1089. This one fairly quick as well. This is and I underline the process part, but this is the audits of investigation, takes effect July 25th as well. Basically, this is just making sure that investigative agencies that handle officer-involved critical incidents, that they are following their policy. They're following the state guidelines and the policies as it relates to these types of investigations. So state auditor with the Criminal Justice Training Center to conduct a process audit, compliance audit on any deadly force investigation, authorizes audit procedure on any law enforcement agency to ensure that the agency follows all laws, policies, procedures, as I already mentioned, prohibits charging a law enforcement agency for any costs associated with the audits. Key consideration: deadly force encounters or investigations rather conducted by the Region 3 Critical Incident Investigation Team, which is the region for which we have been fortunate enough to have to utilize, and that's through the Grace Harbor County Sheriff's Office. That unit is the one that we have utilized for the last few critical incidents that we've been involved with. And of course, so they will have to make sure that they are following the guidelines as it relates to these types of investigations. Any questions on this one? Okay. House Bill 1140. This is the one that I personally, I think there could be some long-term challenges with. It's the juvenile access to attorneys, and I fully support the constitutional rights and an individual's right to an attorney. I'll hit on the bullets of this first and then discuss my concerns. So requires a juvenile under the age of 18 access to an attorney for consultation prior to a juvenile waiving any constitutional rights if the officer questions a juvenile during a custodial interrogation, detains, and you see I have that underlined, detains a juvenile based on probable cause of involvement in criminal activity, or requested a juvenile consent to an evidentiary search of their person, property, dwelling, or vehicle. And it goes in the next bullet, prohibits a juvenile from waiving their right to be provided access to an attorney. So if I have a 17-year-old that I stopped because he was doing donuts in the Aberdeen school and there was a bunch of kids around and it looks like it's reckless driving, I stopped this 17-year-old. I am then detaining this individual for a crime. I have probable cause that he committed the crime of reckless driving. Under that simple type of situation, I would not be able to question him. I would have to provide access to the state's it's going to be referred to as the State Office of Public Defense. This child could tell me, I know what I did wrong. My dad's going to give me more than what you would give me. I don't need to talk to an attorney. I'll take my lumps. He cannot waive that right. So we have to make sure that we provide them access to an attorney before we would do any questioning. The next bullet there prohibits any statement made by a juvenile from being admissible in a court proceeding unless the juvenile was provided access to an attorney, requires the State Office of Public Defense to provide access to attorneys for juveniles contacted by law enforcement. And then the key considerations, the number of juveniles requiring access is underestimated. So according to our association, WASPIC, and maybe Corporation Council may have more specifics on the numbers, but it's the belief that there are not going to be enough attorneys online, 24/7 to handle the entire state of Washington for these types of referrals. The second challenge would be if you have multiple juveniles, and then one simple explanation or example would be a minor in possession of alcohol party. And back in my former life, I used to respond to a lot of those as a deputy. And when you get there and you have a keg in the middle of the room and you'd have a dozen kids there, typically you go in, even though technically they're all in violation of the law because they're in possession. Normally we'd find out who was drinking, who wasn't. We'd call parents. But under this, if we had probable cause, then all of them would have access to attorney. Are they going to have 12 attorneys on board? Because it could be a conflict of interest if one attorney covers all of them. But we'll see. We'll see. They have until January 1st, 2022 to have this up and running. But on that part, we believe there are some challenges. So key concerns. Juveniles not being held accountable for their actions, which could extend into adulthood. I mean, I'm going to go on my 32 plus years of experience and a parent of adult children now. And, while my upbringing, I was truly one of those, I had more fear from my father than what I thought law enforcement would do. Now, fortunately, I guess I didn't do enough to get in trouble that prevented me from being a police officer. But I really see this could be challenging because juveniles do stupid things, and hopefully they learn from those things before they become adults. And the juvenile system is designed to give second chances. And so I fear that in the long run, this could be challenging, not having kids learning from their mistakes. The second part that I have here, and this really is based on my experience, almost 10 years as a detective sergeant. One of the saddest cases, if you will, is when you're dealing with children and you're dealing with sex offenses. And there have been many cases where very young children have been victimized, and the offender was, to use this bill, would be 16 or 17-year-old kids. So oftentimes you get the call from a parent. The Child Advocacy Center, which is now referred to as Connections, would interview the child victim. You may establish enough probable cause that then the offending suspect, if you will, is the 16 or 17-year-old child. If there's probable cause, then that individual is going to have to speak to an attorney first before we can even question them. And I will tell you, I've had many cases where this has happened, interviewed the 16 or 17-year-old, they admit to what they're doing, and then found out that this offending child was victimized themselves. And so we were able to go back and offer support and the resources that the victim child needed, offer support and services for that suspect child, if you will, and hopefully get them the help that they need so they can move on to a more productive life. So I'm just sharing my prior experiences as an investigator. I really see there could be some challenges with respect to this. I hope I'm wrong, but time will tell. So questions on 1140. Okay, move on to House Bill 1223. This is the Uniform Electronic Recordation of Custodial Interrogations, also effective January 1st. This is where it requires that any custodial interrogation for an adult for a felony offense or a juvenile for any offense be electronically recorded. We must have both audio and video in cells, jails, and law enforcement offices. Fortunately, we do have an interview room that has that capability here at the police department. Other location, there must be a minimum of audio. And so establishes limited exceptions to electronic recording requirement and limits admissibility of the statements if we don't follow these rules. So the new law doesn't require body-worn cameras, which would be the most reasonable way to comply with this requirement. But this is going to have an added cost. I'll get down on the bottom part of this. For those who may be interested, I have sat through a demonstration with Axon body-worn cameras. They are, I think, one of the leading companies with body-worn cameras. And we did get an estimate for a 5-year contract of $420,000, which doesn't include, I think if we were to go that route, we would need at least one more FTE in the support division to handle the public disclosure requests and really handle this program. Today, actually, we had a presentation with body-worn. We were very impressed with that. It is cheaper, but it is at about $75,000 a year. And again, I think we would need an FTE to help facilitate having body-worn cameras. Now, in the meantime, and we were planning on wanted to get smartphones in patrol cars anyway. We have done that for patrol and detectives. We will submit in our 2022 budget for services involving government-approved cloud-based storage to cover the required recordings, because this has to be CJIS compliant as it relates to these types of recordings. And that estimated cost for that is about $5,000. So I'm certainly willing to have a further conversation with council. If there's any interest at all to pursue body-worn cameras, I will tell you there is a huge officer safety component associated with this as well. And there's also storage. Right now, we're looking at needing to pay more money for storage through the E911 system. This could be a means of saving some money on that, but I'll leave that for another day. So any questions on 1223? Okay, 1267, and this is the Office of Independent Investigations. This is the bill that establishes a statewide investigative unit to investigate officer-involved critical incidents. This will be within the Office of the Governor and establish certain requirement and qualifications for the investigator. It designates the OII as the lead investigative body for any investigation it chooses to conduct under its jurisdiction, which basically means, and we'll have a requirement where we have to call them. They get to pick and choose the ones that we want to respond to. So we still need to keep the current teams in place intact. Does require CJTC to provide training, priority training, registration to OII personnel, requires OII to conduct analysis and research, which is what you would hope any entity like this would do, requires all law enforcement agencies to immediately notify OII of any serious use of force incident. As you can see, this is effective July 25th. However, this team, obviously this unit is not up and running and won't be for quite some time. I'm hopeful that the state will share with us what their contact information, given that we will be required to notify them after July 25th. It does require that the scene of the incident subject to the jurisdiction of the OII be relinquished to them if requested, which makes sense, and then does require all OII advisory board to access whether the jurisdiction should expand to conduct investigations of other types of incidents committed by involved officers. So, and I put as in custody deaths, sexual assaults of law enforcement officers. Let me jump to the next one and then I'll open for any questions. So with respect to this, key considerations is this: it is necessary for existing independent investigation teams to remain in place, as I already shared, of the use of deadly force by law enforcement officer if the OII chooses not to take the investigation. It remains unclear what if any ability any involved agency has to conduct an investigation into the underlying conduct for which the involved officer were present. So in other words, if we have a bank robbery at Southside Timberland and officers respond there, individual comes out armed, shoots at the officers shoot back and injures the individual, that would warrant a call to the OII. What we're not quite sure is, are they just going to handle the shooting by the officer, or are they going to handle the entire, it was a bank robbery, it was which we would deem an attempted murder on the officer, some of those other components. Those I'm sure will get answered in due time, but those are just some of the considerations. And then it is unknown how long agencies will need to hold a crime scene in order for the OII team to arrive. I'm not sure, if they plan on having regional teams like in Seattle, Vancouver, Spokane, or exactly how that's going to be made up. So questions on 1267. Okay,
If
and
you
I
may-
know I'm throwing a ton. Yes.
Quick question. Have they explained what this OII, is it going to be made up of officers, former officers, community members? Any
So-
idea?
Yes, so that this particular law is 1267. It is it's 22 pages long, and it goes into great detail as it relates to who can be on the team. Now, I will tell you, I think there has to be a period of time that a law officer is no longer an officer before they can apply to be an investigator. And so I will share there. So I've had the pleasure of being, I guess for lack of a better word, when I was with the sheriff's office, I was on the Region 3 Critical Incident Investigation team, and I've been involved in dozens of officer-involved shootings in that 5-county region. And they sent me to specialized training. And as I shared, I had a considerable amount of experience as an investigator. And my very first call out was actually to he eventually became Sheriff of Pacific County, Scott Johnson, his shooting down in Long Beach. And what you really need to be very well versed as an investigator, you need to be very well versed on processing crime scenes, evidence collection. There's a myriad of things. And so there is some concern that they may get individuals in there that will not have that skill set. Time will tell. I do know that there has to be, if I recall correctly, you can't be a current police officer. There has to be some separation of service before you can apply. And so that will certainly be something that we'll be following. And obviously the prosecuting attorney's office as well, because of course, if you have a situation and you have probable cause, of course, they got to prove beyond reasonable doubt. You want to make sure that there is no missteps when it comes to statements, when it comes to evidence and things of that nature in order to make your, the best case possible. Okay, House Bill 1310, use of force, and again, effective July 25th. This is probably one of the most more concerning changes coming about for law enforcement. And there are 3 slides total that I hope will illustrate the changes and concerns. So this authorizes law enforcement officer to use deadly force when necessary to protect against an imminent threat or serious physical injury or death, and I'm good with that. The next bullet requires an officer exhaust available and appropriate de-escalation tactics prior to using any physical force, if possible. Only authorizes physical force in very limited circumstances. So definitions mean everything. And I think I shared earlier, the Blake decision and that law that got overturned and thrown out and ruled unconstitutional really came down to one word, and that one word was knowingly. And so in the law enforcement community, there's a reason that most laws have definitions at the very start. So we know exactly what it is and the intent of the legislature when they put these together. In this case, available is not defined, appropriate is not defined. And so that is concerning for law enforcement. The next thing, when using physical force, use the least amount of physical force necessary to overcome resistance under circumstances. And then the term physical force with respect to this bill, this law is not defined. Terminate the use of force as soon as the necessity for such force ends, and we're good with that. But as you can see in red, directs officers to leave the area if there is no threat of imminent harm and no crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed. And I will tell you, it's really, that is the one that is probably causing us some of the most grief as it relates to 1310. And I will get into some specifics in the latter slides for that. As you can see, next bullet, by July 21st, 2022, Attorney General will develop and publish model policy on law enforcement use of force and de-escalation tactics. The frustrating thing for us a little bit is we are mandated to follow this July 25th. The state Attorney General's office has until July of 2022 before they come up with the model policies as it relates to this. Requires law enforcement agencies to submit their model policies to the Attorney General. We're good with that. And then requires basic training provided by CJTC to be consistent with the use of force requirements and limitations. And we're good with that. Any training we can get, the better. So key concerns: officers have been called upon to assist with various non-criminal related matters, which include ITAs, juvenile runaways, suicidal or mental health situations, hospital security, etc. And I will get into the specifics of each of those on the next slide. It appears this law will also impact how law enforcement handles situations involving reasonable suspicion, contacts, and stops under decades of federal law established in Terry stops, or what we often refer to as Terry versus Ohio. And I'll get into that a bit more as well, but it's kind of back to the point that Councilwoman Ellis inquired about, is when it deals with it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we get a call of a suspicious person. It was, officers respond, he's all decked out in black, has a backpack, and we've had recent burglaries there. Oftentimes that would be enough reasonable suspicion to contact the individual. If we had reasonable suspicion to detain the person, that person was not free to go. If this person decides that they're going to then walk off, it would appear that there's going to be some challenges in officers using force, because we do not have probable cause that a crime has been committed, and yet we do not have a fear that there's imminent threat of harm to ourselves or somebody else. So this could have some pretty significant implications for officers when we're dealing with suspicious circumstance type of situations. So, and again, I'll get into that a little bit more on the next slide or the slide after that. So this is still House Bill 1310, use of force, specific to ITAs. ITAs deals with the Involuntary Treatment Act, and that's under, for those who may be interested in researching that is RCW 71.05. The intent of that ITA law, and I think that was from 2017 or 16, was to protect the health and safety of persons suffering from behavioral health disorders. Law enforcement often would assist designated crisis responders, we often refer to them as DCRs, with taking individuals into protective custody so they could receive the treatment they needed. During the 2021 legislative session, there was an amendment added to the bill that would have allowed law enforcement to use force when necessary for these types of situations. However, the legislature rejected that provision. This rejection indicates the legislature's intent that they do not want law enforcement utilized for involuntary situations. And so this, you may have seen some articles of recent throughout the state where some jurisdictions are just flat refusing to respond to suicidal subjects or individuals with that fall under the ITA. And that is unfortunate, because these individuals often are in crisis. They are humans. They deserve to be provided the assistance that they need. And so for law enforcement, and if I may share, or personally, I think law enforcement in Washington State does an exceptional job in dealing with persons in crisis. And I'm very proud of the folks with the Aberdeen Police Department that I think do an exceptional job as it relates to this as well. So this certainly has some concerns for us. I will tell you that we have a meeting with our local crisis responders, the DCR partners, on July 8th to discuss this impact of the bill further. But I think it's going to be challenging for us. I expect we will still respond, but when it comes to the point of using any type of force, I think our hands are going to be tied on that. Questions before I go on to the second part of this?
Yes, Chief, this is Councilmember Ellis again. Could this be an opportunity perhaps for an interagency agreement where all of the public responder agencies in our area could perhaps share an FTE or two for somebody skilled in mental health response?
I will tell you that so that I think you're aware that the Aberdeen Hope and Cosmopolis Police Departments recently applied for a grant for a police navigator. I certainly think that that position could be of assistance to help individuals in crisis navigate the system. But to be frank, we, as I shared earlier, the state of Washington has done a horrific job, in my opinion, as it relates to dealing with the number of individuals we have in the state that have mental health issues. And unfortunately, our DCRs are not trained to deal with volatile individuals. And so I'm not sure. And then officers are really going to be faced with, if there's not probable cause that the crime has been committed, but there's not imminent danger that they're going to cause harm to somebody else. As I mentioned, as I showed you earlier, the law is saying that they prefer us to walk away. So we're kind of walking a fine line here. And the other part of this is, if an officer violates the provision of this, as I mentioned at the very start of this PowerPoint, they could be subject to suspension with their peace officer certification, which basically would lose their job. So there are some ramifications if officers were to violate this. And the other part, as the chief of police, I got to be very sensitive about the situations that I'm going to put my officers in, and really try to mitigate that as best as I can to make sure that we don't violate these rules as they've been written.
Just a follow-up, how much wiggle room do you have in how you decide to what's the word, how you would follow up with an officer who violated this use of force law? Is there like a step series of a first warning, or is it you violate this law and you're found in violation of this law and that's it, you're out?
Nope. So that, all of our staffs, there's due process, and then we do have internal procedures in place. Obviously, there's the duty to intervene. I would hope we would never get to the point where it's excessive. And then we have another officer that has to report that officer. But of course, I would expect that they would, especially given, the changes in the law. Even before that law came into place, I would expect my staff to make sure that all of our people stay within what is reasonable. But it really comes down to as I shared, the legislature was pretty clear that force is not to be used unless we have probable cause that the crime has been committed, or that there is an imminent threat of danger to that person or someone else. So I'll move on then to the next part of 1310, use of force. And again, I just highlighted, as I've shared already with Councilwoman Ellis, directs officers to leave the area if there is no threat of imminent harm and no crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed. And so that leaves in the question so many other things that officers respond to. Where are we at with juvenile runaways? I mean, it's, I've had cases where a 14-year-old fled from California and I stopped on a traffic stop and found this, and the child comes back as a runaway. It's not a crime, but the state of California is wanting this child. I don't have probable cause to arrest her. It's a civil matter. If this child decides that she doesn't want to go with me, where am I at? And so that's just, and all of these are really are unanswered questions for us that we hope that we will get more direction here in the very near future. The same holds true with civil standbys. We often get calls that, will you please come by and stand by to keep the peace? Evictions is another one. Parenting plan transfers, suicidal or mental health situations. Hospital security is another one. Tomorrow morning, myself and Commander Green will be meeting with the CEO, Tom Jensen, with respect to the security that the Aberdeen Police Department and some other surrounding law enforcement officers under my direction provide security to the hospital. We're going to reevaluate that because, again, I need to limit the situations for which I would put officers in for which they would use force in a situation where they shouldn't use force. And so, and it goes on, where there's just so many non-criminal matters for which we respond to. And as you can see from the second to the last bullet, it appears the law will also impact how law enforcement handles situations involving reasonable suspicion. I talked about that a little bit with my example of laws. Current state and federal law allows law enforcement to physically detain a person under reasonable suspicion. The change in House Bill 1310, however, appears that not allow force to be used if an individual decides to flee, if we do not have probable cause of a crime. And then, as I shared a bit earlier, violation of this law by a law enforcement officer could lead to a revocation of the peace officer certification. But there's a whole process, there's a due process that's associated with that. But I guess my main point here is I just keep in mind that this is what's kind of holding over the head of our officers, recognizing that, okay, we certainly don't want to violate anybody's rights. We don't want to cause harm when we don't, especially, don't want to, but we don't want to be in a position where we do go hands-on and find out that we shouldn't have gone hands-on because they could be personally liable and their jobs could be on the line. So that has, I'm sure you can appreciate, that has caused some anxiety for our officers as we move forward, because there is a lot of uncertainty still at this point. Questions on House Bill 1310? And I know I'm throwing a ton at all of you, and I will certainly be open to questions after the fact, especially after I share the PowerPoint later on.
I have a quick question, Chief Shumate.
Yeah, Councilman Kennedy.
Thank you very much. Just in regards to fleeing, isn't fleeing from a law enforcement officer a crime in itself? And I know it's like a really, it just came to my mind. It's like this. Would that actually kind of negate some of this, or?
So, that is exactly something that was brought up by other law enforcement members. And at least at this point, and it goes back to the legislature's intent, and it was not recommended that an officer then pursue an individual for a fail to cooperate or obstructing a police officer, because they did not believe that the courts would look favorably on an officer or an agency if he had a situation, like I said, it was an individual fled. We then took off after this person, got in an altercation with this individual, and it escalated. The knife was pulled, the shots were fired, and then ultimately it's going to come back to, okay, well, what gave you the authority to pursue them? Because House Bill 1310 specifically said, was there PC? Well, no, I didn't have PC. And you're trying to say PC was established by obstructing an officer, and they do not believe the courts are going to buy it. And so that really, and we don't want to be the test case, to be frank. So, but that's a good point, because we brought that up as well. Any other questions?
Chief
Yes.
Shumate, going back up to juvenile runaways, what kind of scenario fits into what we've been reviewing, where you would even be able to identify somebody as a juvenile runaway?
Well, I mean, there's several situations. One is that a parent will often call and say, hey, I reported my son, my daughter as a runaway. I believe they're over here. Officers will respond. They may find that individual. Now, currently, we would take, if that child had been signed as a runaway, we would take that child into protective custody. And there's been many times, actually, we had one not too long ago, we sat on the child for nearly 6 hours while the guardian or parent came from Seattle to pick the child up. So the question is, what happens if this child does not want to go willingly? Now, unless you had a situation where you can say that perhaps there are other crimes associated with where this child's at, or there's an endangerment piece, but there is still some unanswered questions on this. It really comes down to the use of force. And as I've shared, and I highlighted again, that unless there's an imminent harm to that child, or we have probable cause to believe that that child committed a crime, because runaway is not a crime, officers are going to be somewhat limited.
Yeah. So if the juvenile runaway does not want to cooperate, you can't hardly do anything unless, what about where you mentioned earlier about having to bring a attorney in there for that individual to confer with before you can do anything as a police officer?
Yeah, so that's a little bit different. This, as I shared, a runaway is not a crime. When we need to have the juvenile consult with an attorney when we have probable cause to believe that they committed a crime. So they're kind of two separate things.
Okay.
Okay.
Chief, I've got a quick one.
Yes.
Oh, and thank you so much for walking us through all of this information. This is really interesting and helpful to understand. Well, not really understand, but at least gain an appreciation of all of this stuff. I know sometimes officers work as independent contractors, say doing security at an outside event or for a private business. Because they are police officers, are they required to follow these same laws outside of the police work?
So great question. Now I will tell you, so with respect to the community hospital is probably the best example. And we have an agreement with community hospital where they do pay our officers. We do allow our officers to be in uniform up there, but they, I would say under your situation, it's considered outside employment. And so officers with the Aberdeen Police Department and most other agencies are the same way. If they want to pursue outside employment, they're required to request approval from me as the chief. And so I don't know of any other work that any of our officers do outside of the security for the hospital. But under those situations, they're a commissioned law enforcement officer. They may be off duty, but it could be problematic if they ended up going hands-on and they caused harm to an individual. I think they could have there could be some concerns with respect to their certification. That would not be something that I would jeopardize. And then I think one more, was there another question or?
Yes. I was curious, so if somebody flees the scene of a crime with a vehicle and the police officers aren't allowed to pursue them, we're still allowed to write down their license plate number and follow up with the crime while not in pursuit?
Absolutely, but what do you do with the stolen vehicle?
Sure.
I guess my point is oftentimes you have a stolen vehicle. Okay, we know which vehicle it is, but it's reported stolen, so you really won't know what that person is. Now, yes, if we had somebody flee from us and we had a license plate, we certainly could try to find that. I mean, if it were returned to an Aberdeen address or somewhere nearby, officers could go follow up if they found the vehicle. Then what do we do? Well, it's they failed to stop. So that in itself, fail to cooperate, is a misdemeanor offense. Do we go through the expense or unless it's some other scenario where there could be a felony associated with it, but then we would be faced with, okay, we'll impound the vehicle, we'll petition the courts for a search warrant. We may search that vehicle to see if we can identify who the driver was. There's a lot of work that would go into going that route. But I mean, you're right. We certainly could try to follow up after the fact.
Oh, okay, thank you.
You bet. Okay, I will move on to House Bill 1320. This one, I'll go real quick. It's a protection orders. This is the one, as you can see on the very bottom. It is a highly technical 320-page bill that moves and combines certain statutes related to protection orders, while also making substantive changes in the process. For those of you who may be somewhat versed on orders, there are tons of different criminal orders, civil orders, and so this is hopefully a means of bringing these all together. I'll go down, repeals 137 existing statutes that are related to protection orders. So this is kind of a housekeeping thing here. So I'm going to quickly move on. So Senate bills, so 5038, open carry of weapons at demonstrations. And this one, as you can see, already went into effect. So this prohibits open carry of a firearm and or weapon within 250 feet of a permitted demonstration. A permitted demonstrations occur when an individual obtains a permit for a demonstration or a gathering of 15 or more people who are assembled for a single event at a public place that has been declared as permitted by the chief executive, would be the mayor, or by myself. So I'll just finish off the last bullets. A gathering means a demonstration, march, rally, vigil, sit-in, protest, picket, or similar public assembly. This does not apply to lawful concealed carry of a firearm by a person who has a valid concealed pistol license. So I will tell you, the city is currently working on changing our ordinance that will allow individuals to obtain a permit under this law, so they won't have to worry about whether or not they get 15 people or more at this event. And so the situation that we had, just over a year ago, when unfortunately I was out of state, this certainly could have applied to that situation. Had they applied for a permit and they went to a certain area, then we would have to cordon off 250 feet and then make sure any individuals who wanted to open carry that they would be outside that perimeter. Questions on this one?
Chief Schumate, I have a quick question, but Josh
Yes.
Francie, I think, beat me to it, so he can go first.
Isn't it city policy that First Amendment things don't have to apply for a permit? And does that I'm concerned about requiring the permit. I mean, if you can tell that there's 15 people protesting, that's.
Yeah, so here's the thing on that, and I appreciate what you're saying. It's not mandated that you have to get a permit, but I guess as an event organizer, if I wanted to make sure that I did not have issues, then the city is coming up with a process that will allow someone to go in to get a permit ahead of time, if that makes sense. So it's not mandated that you have to have a permit as I showed there, or just make sure you have 15 or more people and show up and then tell me or the mayor that, hey, by the way, I want this to be free of open carry. And then we could designate that as a permitted assembly, even if you didn't get an official permit. Okay. And then Councilman Kennedy, did you?
Thank you very much. First, I'm actually very in support of a lot of the changes in here. But my concern was just in the instance of a march where you're moving and the need to cordon off this 250-foot kind of barrier for something like that. What kind of extra burden is that going to put on the police department to make that happen? I mean, it would the people have to submit a marching route, that kind of thing. It just seems like it's going to be difficult in that area.
That would be very challenging, no doubt. I mean, the logistics of that. Now, again, this has to be public place. Now, if there's going to be a march, unless they want to continue to stay on sidewalks, if they wanted to do a march down the street, then they would have to get a permit, of course, for that. But no, I mean, yeah, if a group of 15 or more people and they wanted this condition and they decided that they were going to go from one place to another, that certainly could create some challenges for law enforcement.
Thank you.
Okay, you bet. Next is Senate Bill 5051. This is the decertification effective July 25th, 21. And this is the one I had talked about earlier where, the officers, if they violate certain laws, they certainly could open themselves up to decertification. And so this establishes criteria for mandatory CJTC decertification of peace officers and correction officers. CJTC may conduct investigations into allegations of improper conduct independent of any employee agency investigation. So, we may do an investigation and we deem that, okay, the appropriate discipline is you're going to be suspended for whatever or what have you. The state CJTC then has the authority. They can still do their own investigation, and then they could also provide discipline as well in the form of a suspension, of decertification, revocation, things of that nature. CJTC may issue public recommendations regarding law enforcement agencies' command decisions, inadequacy of policy or training, investigations or disciplinary decisions regarding misconduct, potential systemic violations of law or policy, unconstitutional policing, or other matters. It expands requirements related to pre-hire background checks, requires law enforcement and correction agencies to report to CJTC within 15 days of occurrence of any death or serious injury caused by the use of force by an officer or any time an officer has been charged with a crime. Authorizes CJTC to impose a civil penalty of up to $10,000 for the failure by an officer or an employee and agency to timely and accurately report information to CJTC. Requires law enforcement and correction agencies to retain personnel records for the duration of officers' employment, plus 10 years, a minimum of 10 years thereafter, and then requires CJTC to maintain a publicly searchable, machine-readable, and exportable database, and specifies that CJTC shall have the sole authority to provide law enforcement basic law enforcement training. And so the key consideration there, as you can see, there is no limitation on how long CJTC can suspend a certification. We would think they would not suspend a certification beyond 24 months, because if you beyond 24 months, and I believe you automatically lose your certification. So any questions on this particular bill? Okay, moving on. And so Senate Bill 5055 grievance arbitration panels, and this is also effective July 25th. Overall, I support this as well. This does establish a rotating pool of not less than 9 and not more than 18 law enforcement grievance arbitrators at the PERC, we call it Public Employment Relations Commission. Requires all grievance arbitrators involving law enforcement personnel as defined in the bill relating to disciplinary action, discharge, or termination to be conducted through the PERC pool of law enforcement grievance arbitrators at PERC. It does grandfather existing collective bargaining agreements from the provisions of the bills as of July 25th, 2021 from the provisions of the bill, unless or until such agreement is opened, renegotiated, or expires. So, once the CBAs come up, which is I think the following year, then by this law that they will have to have this provision within that CBA. So, some of the challenges I know in the past have been law enforcement leaders, whether chiefs or sheriffs, perhaps have disciplined somebody, perhaps maybe even fired an individual, and then for that individual eventually to then get their job back. That can be pretty challenging for an agency, particularly if you have a law enforcement leader that's trying to, if something was egregious enough where they get fired and they're trying to, have consistent discipline. The way the system currently is you would agree on an arbitrator, but oftentimes it seems like these arbitrators would not want to come across as they always voted for labor or they always voted for management. So at times they would kind of go the middle of the ground, and that may not always be in the best interest for law enforcement leaders, sometimes perhaps not in the best interest of staff. So questions on this one? All right, we're getting close to the end. So 5066 is the duty to intervene. Also July 25th. For our local agency, I will just say this, that we work so closely together. I don't think that this is going to be a concern for the most part. The intent of this legislation was to prevent, to be frank, another George Floyd situation where you had an egregious act and there were a number of officers that stood by. So this one, as you can see, it requires an identifiable general authority watching a law enforcement officer who witnesses another law enforcement officer using or attempting to use excessive force to intervene, to end or prevent the use of excessive force and report to a supervisor, incorporates the duty to render first aid into the newly created duty to intervene, prohibits law enforcement agencies from imposing discipline or retaliate in any way against a peace officer for intervening in good faith or reporting in good faith as required by the bill. Requires law enforcement agencies to send notice to CJTC of any disciplinary action resulting from a law enforcement officer's failure to intervene or failure to report. Does require CJTC to develop written model policy on the duty to intervene by December 1st of this year, and then require CJTC to provide duty to intervene training by December 31st, 2023 to all law enforcement officers who completed basic law enforcement training prior to January 31st of 2022. So key considerations, the definition of excessive force appears to not take into consideration different perspectives from different officers on the scene, on the same scene, tensing up furtive movements, weapons, etc. But as I've shared earlier, I really think our agencies, HOCWM, Cosmopolis, the Sheriff's Office, we do work so closely together. I really don't see this being a challenge. Again, it's this was driven, I believe, because of the situation involving George Floyd. Questions on this one? Next is 5259 Senate bill. That's the law enforcement data collection. Requires the Attorney General to contract with an institution of higher education to establish and administer Washington law enforcement use of force report system, establishes certain interactions for which use of force reporting is required, establishes minimum data elements to be reported for relevant interactions, authorizes the AG to require additional interactions and data elements to be included in the use of force reporting program, and then requires all Washington law enforcement agencies to report to the program all data for all covered interactions through incident reports or other electronic means in a format and time frame established by the AG. So this is legislation that may increase local costs that are not provided for in the state budget through increased staff time. It depends on how much they want to do. And I'll say another concern mentioned involves public disclosure requests and whether or not the institution of higher education that receives the various reports would be subject to the same disclosure requirements. The concerns center around an active criminal investigation that are typically not released until the case is closed. And so will they be subject to disclosure even though the case is still active? I'm not sure yet on that. Questions on that one? And then lastly, Senate Bill 5476, and this is the State versus Blake. This was the legislature's fix for that law that was deemed unconstitutional. And as you can see, this is effective immediately and also July 1st, 2021. I believe that should be 2022 because there's several requirements placed on developing a drug treatment program. So this one here, as you can see, requires the healthcare authority to establish a statewide substance use recovery service plan. Requires each behavioral health administrative service organization to establish a recovery navigator program to provide community-based outreach, intake, assessment, connection to services and case management and recovery services. Amends the Uniform Controlled Substance Act to specify that knowing possession of a controlled substance, counterfeit substance, and illegal drug without a prescription constitute a simple misdemeanor. Law enforcement officers are required in lieu of jail booking and referral to the prosecutor to offer a referral to assessment and services encourages prosecutors to divert simple possession charges to assessment, treatment, and other services. It does require basic law enforcement training to include training on interactions with persons with substance use disorders, and then does appropriate $88 million for substance use disorder prevention, assessment, treatment, and recovery services. The simple possession of controlled substances that was ruled unconstitutional, again, as I mentioned, is why this bill came into play. So key considerations. Agencies should clarify and advise officers of the requirement to divert possession offenses in instances where treatment services are not imminently available in a particular community. WASPIC is working to assemble a list of substance use treatment providers around the state to assist agencies in knowing what treatment services are available when diversion is required. And as you can see, the provisions of this law expire July 21st, 2023, so in 2 years. So what's next after 2023? We're not sure. I will tell you, APD has started to track the individuals that we have provided referrals to assessment and services. Unless changes are made, possession of controlled substances will no longer be illegal in 2 years on July 1st, 2023. So questions on this bill? All right, I just have a few more final thoughts I'm going to share, and then I will be done talking, and we'll certainly open it up to questions. And hour and a half I made it through. So overall, I believe there are positive changes that occurred from this past legislative session. Various bills focused on transparency and accountability, a reduction in barriers to discipline and termination, and greater assurances of a fair, more equitable criminal justice system. As chief, I do have concerns of the unintended consequences for some of the laws, as I've shared. Law enforcement can no longer be the default for non-criminal related matters. The department needs to evaluate the types of calls to which we can or should respond to on societal expectations, case law, and liability, and the specific law changes from the last session. A great deal of work is being done to update policies, educate our staff, and train on the various changes. This will be ongoing given the amount of change upon us, and hopefully you recognized, I mean, it really, in some aspects, is somewhat overwhelming, the amount of change. And in many aspects, we are going to expect that our officers are going to be ready to go in just over 3 weeks. So as law enforcement officers, however, we will uphold the law to the best of our abilities. APD will track any added expenses as it relates to these various mandates, and we will report them to WASPIC as that's what they had requested. So with that, questions, and I know I have thrown a ton out at all of you. I will tell you, though, a great deal of work has gone into prepare this PowerPoint, knowing that we still had a lot of unanswered questions moving forward.
Chief,
Well, I think the amount of work that has gone into this is pretty apparent. Maybe if, unless you had another slide, maybe you can stop sharing your screen and it'll be easier for us to talk.
Absolutely. There you go. Perfect.
And so do any council members have questions for the chief? Councilmember Ellis.
Thank you. Chief, you referenced back when you were talking about the electronic recording requirement that it seemed like a concern of yours was the cost for data management with that. And that by having body cameras, that would further create a perhaps an unfunded or additional cost that we would need to cover?
So I shared with the council what the cost would be if we went to body-worn cameras. It is the thoughts of many in law enforcement that this is the direction that the state is going in. And to be frank, if money were an option or an issue, I would love nothing more than have body-worn cameras on all of my staff. I'm very confident that we, day in and day out, they do what we ask of them, and they do it professionally. And in many cases, I can think of one in particular critical incident that we had here in downtown. Had we had a body-worn camera, the challenges that we had early on would have not occurred. had it not, had we had this type of thing. With that said, you may recall on the last part of this, at a minimum, I will put in my 2022 budget $5,000, which will cover the added storage that we will need for our smartphones in order to be able to do these audio recordings out in the field. And as I shared, that particular statute does not come into effect until January 1st, 2022. I just want to be ready to go by January 1st, 2022.
And then, does it seem to you that a lot of this legislation is trying to encourage police departments towards more community policing approaches rather than like going after crime?
You know, if I may share, one of the things that I was very passionate about with my former employer and really brought that with me to the city of Aberdeen, though I certainly had more duties when I became chief of Aberdeen, was community engagement. And I have had the absolute pleasure of helping form numerous, I think like 14 different neighborhood block watch groups throughout Grays Harbor County, and I'm affiliated with some here within the city of Aberdeen. And then we also did citizen academies, and we are the only agency that has an Explorer program. So community engagement is huge, and I have never lost sight of the fact in my 32 years that I work for the citizens now, the citizens of Aberdeen, and recognize that our taxpayers are the ones that help fund the Aberdeen Police Department. And so back to your inquiry, to me, and when I first started, community policing was somebody was on the side of the road and they had a flat tire. I pulled over and I helped them change that flat tire. And there were many times as a young patrol deputy where there was various things that I did for citizens that really did not fall in within the realm of what a traditional police officer would do. I just did it because it was the right thing to do and I had the time to do it. I think a lot of the things that the legislature put before us in the state of Washington is really they're wanting us to limit our involvement and or exposure perhaps on many of these things that I think is engagement with our community. So, you know, I posed the question early on that this is reimagining policing, but what is it exactly? So I'll be frank, I'm having some challenges with what this will look like because I spent 32 years on always pursuing those who committed crimes, being there for those who are underserved or those who have been victimized. And in some aspects, that some of these laws are really limiting that. So I wouldn't say that there's a focus, at least on the laws that have been passed, that there's necessarily a focus on community policing, or perhaps I have a different understanding of what community policing is all about. And let me also throw out our volunteers. I got to give a shout out to our volunteers, which is just another component of community engagement and having our citizens involved with the police department.
Thank you. Any other council members have questions? Council member Kennedy.
Thank you very much. Not necessarily a question, but more of a bit of a comment. I just, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I think this is answering a lot of questions that many of us have in regards to this current legislation. I'd also just like to share that in pretty much every single conversation I have with our community, they are always talking about how much they like our police department and how much they feel that our officers are there to help and protect, and especially from our community members that are persons of color that have moved in from out of the area, and our minorities. I have not, encountered any of them that have had adverse experiences, which I think is amazing, especially, when you hear about things going on in some other rural areas. And it's really unfortunate that the police department does have to do some aspects of the job that are not always, enjoyable or that happen to be adversarial. But that is part of the job. So I just wanted to thank you and the officers of APD and as well as Hoquiam and Cosmopolis. I just, can't say enough about how good of a job you guys are doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Any other council members? Well, I guess I have one observation and one question.
Councilmember Richard had his hand up.
Oh, where's Alan? Oh, go ahead, Alan.
Well, and like some of the others, I started taking notes, and after 3 notebooks, I just gave up and decided to deal with the slide deck. I'm not sure how much of this would be available to you, but this, as you said, is an enormous amount of change heaped on us in one time, and the ability to correct the problems and solve the problems that will inevitably come up. Is there any of that can be in the hands of the local law enforcement establishments, or is that all going to have to be legislative?
I think for the most part, it's going to have to be legislative. And as I shared earlier, I mean, definitions are very important, words are very important, intentions are very important. And so, like the issue with our less lethal shotguns and the 50 caliber restrictions that, we are getting some legal input, but at the end of the day, is that something that, our officers we're going to allow them to remain in the vehicles or not? And so there's going to have to be some decisions on our part, to be quite frank, as it relates to that. But I think for the most part, and there has been communication with a number of legislatures with respect to unintended consequences. I mean, if you think about it, and I've shared, I think I said it's been a bit overwhelming. Unprecedented was another word I use, and that's very accurate. And so you are going to expect that there are going to be some things that perhaps they didn't think of, they didn't realize would affect something else. But I think it's going to take a legislative fix in some of these areas in order to address what some of those challenges are going to be.
Any other council members? So my question, Chief, was on some of these areas where you're looking for clarification or definitions. To what extent can the WAC process assist in that? I mean, as the code is written, is that work in play?
I don't know, but perhaps if Corporation Counsel, so we had inundated her with a number of inquiries late last month. And I know that she's been busy dealing with various other things. So I'm not sure. Patrice, did you have any input with respect to WACs?
So the so for those who are not up on the acronyms, the RCW is the Revised Code of Washington, which is the statute. And then the WACs are the Washington Administrative Code. And the WAC is what the regulatory agencies use to for the procedures for the RCWs. Everybody is working on this as fast as their little fingers and toes can work on it. This is a tremendous amount that came down, and really it was at the last days of the legislature that the bills passed, being amended up until almost the very last day in many of these cases. So everybody's working on it. I'm in a group called WASAMA, the Washington State Association of Municipal Attorneys, and they've got several working groups that are going on it. So between WASPIC talking about kind of the boots on the ground issues, and again, Chief Shumate, thank you so much for this presentation, and I'm looking forward to seeing it as well as we're moving forward. It's ongoing, and there's a lot of good communication going between the lawyers, the enforcement agencies, law enforcement, to make sure that the administrative code is as reasonable as it can be given the restrictions of the legislation. I wish I could give you a more specific answer, but that's kind of where we are.
Well, I would just echo Councilmember Kennedy's comments about how well policed we are in Aberdeen, and the training and the effort that goes into keeping us safe. Because for every House bill or RCW that you brought up tonight, I could see in my mind's eye the very specific high-profile case that prompted that law. And in some cases, you could say this is an emotional overcorrection to a failing elsewhere in the state, and that somehow, you know, all of us are, there's an overcorrection going on, and yes, it's going to have to, you know, take its time, but there was a lot of emotion involved in these cases, and they're probably just, like you described, there just wasn't any negotiating at the legislative level, because some of these failures were pretty significant on how the public was let down by police agencies elsewhere, not in Aberdeen though. So that's it's unfortunate that it's playing out this way, but that's kind of how I see it. And just so keep on it and keep advocating for good police departments like Aberdeen and to get us the tools we need to keep doing our job.
Awesome. Thank you. And absolutely. Yeah, I will just share, blessed to have the group of people that I have that I get to work with every day. So
if there's no other council comments, I would invite the mayor to share his thoughts if he wanted to.
Thank you. I would just, all I have to say to Chief Shoemate is very well done report. I thank you very much for your patience to do that and answer all our questions. I'm sure this is going to be ongoing for a while, and we'll be certainly hearing more about it. If there's no more questions for the chief, though, I do have one more issue that'd just be real brief and that I'd like to bring up, if that's okay with everybody.
And if it's not,
As long as it's within the purview of the workshop, because I think we might not be able to
So
do
I
anything
think,
outside of that.
I'm not exactly sure what the mayor is bringing up, but I did know that he had sent an email that there was, are you talking about the Gateway, Mayor?
Exactly.
So I did some research on whether, even though it wasn't published, I did some research on whether we could add to our agenda tonight. And we can add to our agenda tonight, but for the purposes of transparency, I think that I do want council agreement to talk about the Gateway. And then I would like our posting on the website to be amended to reflect that we had a conversation about the Gateway. Since we don't have an agenda and we aren't taking minutes, but I think that we can't take action, obviously, but I would like there to be some sort of paper trail, if you will, that this came up. So if the council is amenable, we can't vote, but unless anyone objects, the mayor gave us a heads up. He wanted to talk to us, so I'm gonna let him proceed.
Okay, thank you. We learned a lot from the first RFQs we sent out on the Gateway. We feel that we need to be more specific to narrow it down to our needs on the request for a project manager. So I guess basically that's it. There's a lot of questions in order to, there's a lot of things that one question will answer so that we can be more specific with our request. And that question is, how much money does the council wish to spend out of our reserves on the Gateway building project? So we're looking at somewhere around $7 million. And the city of Aberdeen. So I'm bringing that up so we can move forward with this currently. Any thoughts, comments?
Is that a total amount for the total project, or?
No, that's the amount that we feel the city needs to contribute to the project so that we can have a specific amount that we can put in the request for a project manager to seek funding for.
So once
Oh.
again, is this you making a proposal, Mayor? Because I don't know who we is. The council is we when we talk about the city of Aberdeen. Is this a proposal you're making? Because there's a
Lisa's-
gateway committee and I know they haven't proposed this.
Lisa Scott is pursuing a project manager and writing up a new request for qualifications. And in order to make this work for the city of Aberdeen's needs, we need to answer some questions. And in order to get specific on the requirements for a project manager, we need to know how much the city's putting in the kitty. So
I'll recognize Councilmember Andrews at this time.
So I guess what I'm thinking is we do have a Gateway Center committee. So maybe the mayor should take whatever information to the committee and then the committee can make a recommendation to the council, because it has to be a vote of the council. It can't be, I mean, we can talk about it right now, but we can't make any decisions in a workshop, so.
absolutely. I understand that. I'm just trying to keep things moving as fast as possible. That's all.
Well, then, yeah, then I suggest we schedule a meeting.
Councilmember Ross.
I would say that I would agree with Councilmember Andrews. Let's put it to the committee to discuss and understand what we're bringing to the council, so everybody has a better understanding.
Okay. Nathan?
Councilmember
Council
Kennedy.
President Shaw, is it okay? Thank you. So I just wanted to make a comment because I had my hand up earlier, and I totally agree with Councilmember Andrews and Ross. Please put this through the committee, the ad hoc committee we have been established for this, and bring it before the council so that we have all of the information in front of us and we can actually take action.
Okay. That's all I had, Deanne. No need
Thank
to
you,
go any
Mayor.
further.
Director Scott, did you have anything you wanted to share? I see your videos on.
No, I just wanted to say, yeah, when we put out the RFP for qualifications, and what we got back were 2 bid proposals that were very high, not what we were expecting. And part of the challenge that we're running into is the capital campaign to raise funds for the Gateway Center, a tenant recruitment, as well as construction oversight. So I think we were trying to be maybe overly ambitious and wrap it up into one contract. And one of the things that became clearer is the capital campaign and tenant recruitment were very important and maybe first steps in proceeding forward with the development of the Gateway Center. With that being said, part of that is we're nearing the end of the contract with Coates Design, and hopefully he'll be coming shortly to do a presentation to the city council for that final design update. And in part of that is there's roughly a $16 million price tag to the Gateway Center. And so is the city committed still to the Gateway Center project? I think that's a question. And if so, what monetary amount is the city, would the city be willing to contribute? And with that, it would help us develop a more clear RFP that we could go out so that we knew what we were asking a consultant to do in terms of a capital campaign, what amount we're looking to raise, but that showing that the city was supporting this development monetarily. And we had heard that loud and clear from the state legislature as well, with the funds that they had put in. So I think that's where we're at. But from what I heard, and I'll take my direction from the mayor, but it sounds like we need to take that back to the committee, have the committee make the recommendation back to city council, and we can do that.
Thank you. Do any other council members have a comment or questions on this topic? Well, seeing none, again, thanks everybody for coming tonight, and thank you, Police Chief Shoemate, for the exhaustive presentation. But I know that that's just barely the tip of the iceberg, and it's a lot. So please send out the PowerPoint. I know we'll all be referring to it frequently and often as we progress through the year and things come up. And keep us posted through Tawny or as needed in our committee of the whole meetings, where it's going to be an interesting year. If no other council members have anything they want to share, I will adjourn the meeting. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you,
Have a
Steve.
good night.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody.